Greetings, everyone. My name is Della. I'm an author and community organizer based in the Toronto area, and I focus on educating the Black community on Pan-Africanism, ancient history, anti-Blackness, socioeconomics, and how all those topics are interconnected. I'm currently pursuing my bachelor's degree in journalism, and I wrote my first book, 166 Days of Excellence, which is a calendar guide of heroic and courageous figures and events related to worldwide liberation advancements that are not normally taught in schools. The topic for this PowerPoint presentation is the historical foundation of systematic anti-Blackness in Canada, which was inspired by the book Policing Black Lives by Robyn Maynard, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to Present. I was motivated to do this 4-part series to help educate not just Black people living in Canada, but everyone interested in independent studies that is purposely not taught in schools. I wanted to create an easy to follow timeline because this is the first book of its kind pertaining to history in Canada, and it was only written in 2017. I think it's very important to understand how systematic anti-Blackness works to build meaningful solutions for the Black community. As Black people, we are targeted, or at least know someone who has been targeted by some form of anti-Blackness, but just because we have been targeted doesn't mean we fully understand why and how we are targeted. Consider this example. If a stranger punched you in the face and attacks you, hopefully, I would hope your urge is to fight back and defend yourself. But just because you have the desire to fight back doesn't mean you know how to fight or you know how the stranger fights. If you have no knowledge in self-defense, you will only apply yourself to the first thing that comes to your mind in a reactionary emotional state. You can't stop the fight to learn how to fight. So the best time to train how to fight is anytime before it actually happens. But you will never know if a fight will happen. If you stay ready, you won't have to get ready. So in the context of anti-Blackness, education helps us understand how we are attacked so we can effectively build long-lasting solutions of defense. So before I get started, this presentation is dedicated to my publisher, Desiree Crooks, who transitioned in August to the spiritual realm, who fought against ovarian cancer. She was dedicated to teaching children, and she published a children's book on the liberation story of Queen Nzinga. And she was on the verge of actually opening up a daycare before the pandemic struck. I was blessed to have known her and published my first book with her, 166 Days of Excellence. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to jump into today's presentation. So this is the historical foundation of Canadian systematic anti-Blackness. Now this is the complete form. This is actually the original form and presentation that I did as I was reading through the book Policing Black Lives by Robyn Maynard. It was somewhat in chronological order, but she did jump a lot back and forth with the facts. So it wasn't in perfect chronological order. So what I decided to do was create a presentation that went through everything pretty much year by year by year by year to show the complete progression of how systematic anti-Blackness formed. And the reason why I did that was because for me, I know for me, it helps me learn history a lot better. And that's how I like to connect entire world history, because to me, world history is one entire piece stemming from ancient Kemet. I feel like a lot of people take certain parts and pieces of history. Like people will take certain their culture, for instance, and learn their culture. Others, like Black Americans, will take American history, slavery, pre-slavery. A lot of people will stick to the ancient, now civilization history, and don't really progress on to towards the time periods that came after the fall of Black Kemet, African Kemet. So to me, history should be taught as one entire piece, and as we go down chronologically, we branch off or we break off into these into various empires and various cultures that have formed today. I think that is the best way to teach history. It's definitely not easy to do it that way, but I feel like learning history as one piece is definitely something that should be implemented in any type of independent, Afrocentric history curriculum. So that's the same approach I took for this presentation. And what we did in the Carifica Education Committee was we decided to make this a 4-part series for Black History Month, and that's why we broke it off into different themes. But in actuality, those different themes, except for the exception of slavery and segregation, for the most part, slavery and segregation was the very beginning, but a lot of the immigration and labor and sexualization and criminalization of a Black identity also fell pretty much within the same time periods, um, just after slavery, during segregation, after segregation. So in actuality, a lot of the chronological history and the individual presentations actually happened at the same time as well too. So this complete presentation is a good way to review all the presentations at once. I think everybody should go through it after they've gone through the 4 parts and really understand the progression that has happened. So without any further ado, I will start off. This will be a very long presentation, but I feel like it's very necessary to learn the chronological order and to really reinforce the learning of the history. So I'll set the tone for the presentation from the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, a textbook workbook for thought, speech, and or action for victims of racism, aka white supremacy. Quote, if you do not understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. And this book quote was from Neely Fuller Jr. Now, the purpose of this entire complete presentation is to give the Black diaspora the context and historical framework on how systematic anti-Black racism was founded in Canada from enslavement to present. The term anti-Blackness is interchangeable with white supremacy. Anti-Blackness at its core includes white supremacy and also encompasses non-white and even Black people, whether conscious or subconscious, who carry negative thoughts, attitudes, speech, and behavior that only serves to maintain white supremacy or anti-Blackness over Black people. Now, the learning objectives are you'll be learning about the pillars of systematic racism in Canada, enslavement, segregation, media, labor, immigration, criminal justice, education, the anti-Black origin of Canada's multicultural identity, Canada's history of overt anti-Blackness, laws, legislations, institutions through colonial policy against Black and Indigenous people, systematic role of media in perpetuating the over hypersexualization of both Black women and men, Canada's economic head start for European colonial settlers and immigrants, and of course the wealth gap, Canada's economic head start of European colonial settlers and generations of immigrants in this country. This is a map of the transatlantic African Holocaust of the many routes and destinations. In 1628, Oliver Lejeune is the first enslaved African in present-day Quebec by the French. New France, pre-Confederation Canada. He was 6 years old from either Madagascar or Guinea, baptized and given the name Oliver Lejeune in 1633. Lejeune remained in the colony of New France for the rest of his life. 1689, King Louis XIV declares royal assent for enslavement through the book Code Noir. On May 1st, 1689, King Louis XIV officially authorized the importation of enslaved Africans to New France. Black enslavement was reinforced by the next French king, Louis XV, who made two proclamations about enslavement in the 1720s and one more in 1745. Black people were treated as personal property that could be bought, sold, traded, and inherited. The first slaves in New France were indigenous peoples, a large percentage of whom came from the Pawnee Nation located in present-day Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Many were captured during war and sold to other indigenous nations or to European traders. Some French colonists acquired enslaved Black people through private sales, and some received indigenous and African slaves as gifts from indigenous allies. So from France to Canada, this is the Code Noir, and you can see that it's originally started in French. So legacy of Canadian enslavement. In early Canada, the enslavement of African people was a legal instrument that helped fuel colonial economic enterprise practiced by European traders and colonists in New France in the early 1600s and lasted until it was abolished throughout British North America in 1834. Legacy of enslavement in Canada was private ownership based as opposed to large-scale breeding plantation compared to the US. Business owners, judges, government officials, military officials, landlords, doctors, executive councils, butchers, and hospitals, to name a few. So this is another map. During that 2-century period, European settlers in what would eventually become Canada were involved in the transatlantic slave holocaust linked to the commerce of international trade. Products such as salted cod and timber were exchanged for slave-produced goods such as rum, molasses, tobacco, and sugar from slaveholding colonies in the Caribbean. And this is just another map to further demonstrate the transatlantic slave holocaust. 1700s, June 21st, 1734, Angelique's arson riot. Mary Joseph Angelique allegedly set fire to her master's Montreal house and destroyed nearly 50 homes. She was tortured and hanged as a lesson to condition others from rioting. Between 1725 and 1779, Britain signed a series of treaties with various Mi'kmaq, Wulas Tuwij, Obunaki, Punab Scoot, Pasuma Kwadi, peoples living in parts of what are now the Maritimes and Gaspé region in Canada and the northeastern United States. 1752, peace treaty between British Crown and Mi'kmaq people. There were numerous peace and friendship treaties made between 1726 and 1761 that were signed by Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy. So this is how one of the treaties looked like. America versus Britain, 1775 to 1783. First wave of 3,500 Black loyalists go to Shelburne, Nova Scotia. Black loyalists soon discovered that freedom was a far cry from equality. Land grants promised by British authorities were invariably delayed, smaller, and in worse locations than those received by white loyalists. 1781, St. John's Island, PEI, passed a law regulating enslavement, an act declaring that baptism of slaves shall not exempt them from bondage. Black people who now are on this island or may hereafter be imported or brought therein, being slaves, shall continue such unless freed by his, her, or their respective owners. And that was a direct quote from the act. So the main things: number one, baptism did not change slave status. Two, persons enslaved in Prince Edward Island remain so unless manumitted, set free by their owners. And three, children born to enslaved women were born enslaved themselves. Canada's first race riot. On July 26, 1784, a mob of loyalist settlers stormed the home of a Black preacher in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, armed with hooks and chains seized from ships in the harbor. The confrontation ignited a wave of violence in Shelburne County that lasted approximately 10 days. The majority of the attacks targeted the county's free Black population. Thus, the Shelburne riot has been described as the first race riot in North America. After the Revolutionary War, the Black pioneers were among the first settlers in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, and they helped build the new settlement. On its fringes, they established their own community called Birchtown. When hundreds of white disbanded soldiers were forced to accept work at rates competitive with their Black neighbors, hostility caused a riot. So these are more Canadian fugitive slave advertisements in various Canadian newspapers. To encourage white settlers to relocate to the island, an act of parliament was instituted in 1791, offering 40 shillings for every Negro bought by such white person. Europeans were encouraged to settle with incentive, and this was the 1791 Canada Act. So 20 shillings equaled 1 British pound, and about $1 in 1700 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $63.47 today. The first mayor of St. John, New Brunswick, Gabriel G. Ludlow, enslaved Africans. As mayor from 1785 until 1795, several restrictions were placed specifically on the growing Black population that continued after he left office until 1870. Black people could not take an oath to gain the status of free men. They were prohibited from practicing a trade or selling goods in the city, prohibited from fishing at St. John Harbor, and could not live within the city limits unless they were employed as a servant or laborer. 1800s, we have America versus Britain in 1812. 1813 to 1816, the next wave of enslaved and free Africans migrating to Canada. Land promises. Some Black loyalists in Nova Scotia and Ontario did not receive land grants as promised. Those who did were given smaller allotments located on land that was of poorer quality in places physically segregated like North Preston in Nova Scotia and Elm Hill in New Brunswick. And so between the period of 1816 to 1850, segregated Nova Scotia school education curriculum reinforcing to Black children themes of servitude, obedience, submission, to accept roles in menial labor. Segregation was justified to protect white children from proximity to Black and Indigenous children. Schools were closing up until 1850 because of no government funding, no mention of enslavement of the colonization of Indigenous land in schools. Any racial tensions mentioned only explained in the U.S. Canadians saw themselves morally superior to Americans, and we will get to the difference between white Canadians, how white Canadians viewed white Americans. From 1828 to 1996, in Canada, the residential school system was a network of boarding schools for Indigenous children. The network was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs and administered by Christian churches. The school system did not formally start until 1831. The first well-known school is Anglican Church of Canada, from its founding as the Mechanics Institute, a day school for boys on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve. Churches building schools for Indigenous has roots tracing back to 1600s. And we all know the legacy that these residential schools have left. When I did this presentation, it was before they found the mass graveyards. So I'm going to get a number of what those mass graveyards produced. So this article is from the National Post, how Canada forgot about more than 1,300 graves at former residential schools. First Nations are having to counter widespread claims that these are mass graves, or that they were deliberately hidden. Since May, more than 1,300 suspected graves have been uncovered near the sites of former Indian residential schools, 215 in BC, 182 also in BC, 751 in Saskatchewan, and more than 160 found on BC as well. So three different areas in BC and Saskatchewan. And this article was written on July 13th. They started to find the graveyards in May. The discoveries have been one of the clearest illustrations yet of something that has always been well known, that Canada's Indian residential schools spent nearly a century overseeing shockingly high rates of death among their students, with the bodies of the dead routinely withheld from their families and home communities. But as news of the discoveries quickly circulated around the world, it has spawned assertions that the graves were deliberately hidden or that they were mass graves. Neither claim has appeared in statements from the First Nations, who have announced discoveries of unmarked burials. This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves. Kawases First Nation Chief Cadmus Delorme said at the June 24th press conference announcing the discovery of 751 graves outside of Saskatchewan. Here's another article. This was from the Scientific American, and this was written in August 1st. Canada's residential schools were a horror, founded to carry out the genocide of Indigenous people. They created conditions that killed thousands of children. The recent discoveries of more than 1,300 unmarked graves at the sites of 4 former residential schools in Western Canada has shocked and horrified Canadians. Indigenous peoples whose families and lives have been haunted by the legacy of Canada's Indian residential school system have long expected such revelations, but the news has still reopened painful wounds. Residential school survivor testimony has long been filled with stories of students digging graves for their classmates, of unmarked burials in school grounds, and of children who disappeared in suspicious circumstances. Many of these stories were heard by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which was formed in 2008 and collected testimonies from over 6,700 survivors. The TRC's 2015 final report made it quite clear that further recoveries of unmarked graves at the schools were inevitable. The goal of Canada's residential school system, after all, shared that of its U.S. boarding school counterpart: kill the Indian and save the man. More than 150,000 children were taken from their homes between 1883 and 1997, often forcibly and placed in distant boarding schools where the focus was on manual labor, religious instruction, and cultural assimilation. The TRC final report concluded that the Indian residential school system was an attempted cultural genocide, but the escalating number of recovered unmarked graves points to something even darker, given that more than 1,300 graves have been identified using ground-penetrating radar at only 4 of the 139 federally run residential schools. The current official number of 4,100 students known to have died in the schools will end up being only a fraction of the actual total. So I just wanted to share that a very important update about these residential schools and the legacy that it has literally still left behind and we're still discovering till this day. So a lot of this historical information is very important in really understanding the history of Canada and everything that was done to cover up the history today. It's they're making an attempted effort to get to the truth and try to right the wrongs, but it's definitely been long overdue. So we will continue on with the presentation. Slavery Abolition Act, 1833 to 1834. Abolition of enslavement in Canada was 31 years before the States. An act for the abolition of enslavement throughout the British colonies, for promoting the industry of the manumitted slaves, and for compensating the persons hetero entitled to the service of such slaves. Also known as the Slavery Abolition Act, received royal assent on August 28, 1833, and took effect a year later, August 1st, 1834. The act abolished enslavement in most British colonies, freeing over 800,000 enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and South Africa, as well as a small number in Canada. Segregation of Black people in Canada was justified for years following abolishment by reinforcing a racial inferiority complex that had been used to justify enslavement. Practices of racial segregation differed across the country according to province or local municipality. Some Black loyalists in Nova Scotia and Ontario did not receive land grants as promised. Those who did were given smaller allotments located on land that was of poorer quality in places physically segregated like North Preston in Nova Scotia and Elm Hill in New Brunswick. The 1800s, according to Cheryl Thompson, a scholar of communications of Ryerson University, Black residents of Toronto petitioned the city government in vain to ban minstrel shows in the 1840s. And this is a picture of a Virginia minstrel show in 1843 in the United States. I try my best to find a picture of some type of Toronto ad or picture of some sort showing what was going on here in Canada. But this is why I put this quote here to show how far back minstrel shows existed right here in Canada. In a 2005 doctoral thesis, University of Toronto researcher Lorraine Almar Louis Lacombe documented hundreds of minstrel performances across Canada from the 1840s to the 1960s. So that's 100 years, more than 100 years. These included shows mounted by charitable organizations, religious groups, schools, and members of the military and law enforcement. 1850, Fugitive Slave Act in U.S. would effectively push more enslaved Africans into Canada to seek refuge. And this is a newspaper ad talking about the fugitive slave law. Abolitionist, journalist, support of the Underground Railroad, Mary Ann Shadd, in 1854, who was part of the Voice of the Fugitive, coins the term anti-slavery Negro hater. For white Canadians, this describes the illusion of moral superior attitude white Canadians had towards white Americans and the Negro problem that they called it. So this term, anti-slavery Negro hater, is two concepts combined into one. The first one is anti-slavery, so white Canadians weren't in favor of slavery at the time. But we have Negro hater, which means that they didn't like Black people or didn't want to live with Black people. That's why they called the tensions, the racial tensions going on in the States, the Negro problem from America. So we have anti-slavery Negro hater, which white Canadians may have been against enslavement, but they did not want to actively coexist with Black people either, which will be demonstrated in the following decades. White Canadians thought the best way to deal with the Negro problem in America was to block Black people coming into Canada in the first place, and they didn't logically think that was racist. So this is a picture of the Voice of the Fugitive, 1855 to 1941, pass system for Indigenous people, increased state surveillance of Indigenous reserves. The federal government developed the pass system, a process by which Indigenous people had to present a travel document authorized by an Indian agent in order to leave and return to their reserves. And effectively, this pass system also affected Black people at the time as well. Also, this is another picture of the pass system and how it worked. 1858 to 1958, 100 years of data. Data compiled shows disparity of severity of Black men punished for rape against white women compared to leniency of white men accused of rape against Black women. So this just shows the hypocrisy of white men worrying about the morality of Black men and worrying about their women while simultaneously raping Black women, and they're not even handing out justice for that. So it's just a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of black and white with how white men viewed black men as sexual threats, while simultaneously over sexualizing black women as well. 1861 to 1865, American Civil War. 1865 marks the beginning of the end of enslavement in the United States. 1864 to 1873, Black women are 3% of the Halifax population, but make up 40% of incarceration rates in Halifax. Prostitution charge was a way for Black women to be policed and monitored. 1867, British colonies in North America consolidate Canada as a nation on stolen land. 1868, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald evokes the Black rapist myth to justify the threat of lynch mobs to keep rape a capital offense. He made white settlers fear frequency of rape committed by Negroes because Negroes were very prone to felonious assaults on white women. If the sentence and imprisonment were not severe, there would be a great dread of people taking the law into their own hands. 1876, Indian Act forced indigenous into reserves. So this is actually a picture. It's not my text here. So it has reference to Indian, and just to let everybody know, the Aboriginal community prefers to be identified as either Aboriginal or Indigenous compared to Native Indian. So Indian Act of 1876, Indigenous were not residents of Canada, but wards of the state, designed to eliminate Aboriginal culture and assimilate Aboriginals into English Canadian society. Act defined who was an Aboriginal and regulated Indigenous status. An Indigenous woman who married a white man lost her status. Indigenous could not be doctors, lawyers, ministers, or attend university if they wanted to maintain their Indigenous status. Potlatch and other ceremonial and spiritual practices were banned 1884. So that was an amendment. In 1876, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald orchestrated state-sanctioned famine in the prairies against Indigenous. Planned starvation leads to hunger, sickness, and death, which allowed forced relocation and confinement in reserves. This was done to vacate the area for white settlement and railroads. So after all those peace treaties were signed, this is what a leader of a nation, a newly formed nation at that, resorted to take the land from the Indigenous people. 1879, prostitution laws added to the Indian Act increased access into Indigenous homes in reserves. Black women are already disproportionately affected by prostitution laws in Hamilton, Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary. At one point, prostitution laws allowed for the arrest of all common prostitutes or night walkers. Night walkers is a code word, wandering in fields, public streets, or highways, and not giving a satisfactory account of themselves. Black and Indigenous women's worth in Canadian society was devalued as they were over-sexualized and more vulnerable to sexual assaults from white men. 1886, Indigenous prohibited from buying or consuming alcohol, leading to mass incarceration. So this term night walker was a very vague term that didn't necessarily mean prostitution. Many Black women that were working, especially working long hours and long shifts, I touched on it in the presentation of labor and immigration, how they worked long hours, up to 16 hours for some jobs, and they would have to come back home at nighttime So they would have to work these long hours, come back at night, and then be prosecuted and surveilled because they were just walking at night. Thus the term night walkers, and they connected that to prostitution. So this is an important slide in the global anti-Blackness structure and how it relates to Canada. So as slavery was ending, a new form of exploitation, the scramble for Africa, was becoming more organized. Not that this was the beginning, but this was the beginning of a organization between European nations called the British Conference of 1884 to 1885, which consolidates European colonialism, neocolonialism in Africa, the scramble for Africa, one of the greatest crimes during the African Holocaust. So this is like a part two to the Holocaust. Wealth was generated from human and material exploitation. Anti-Blackness was a worldwide assault of Black people and theft of their land and natural resources to empower and enrich invaders. The Treaty of Berlin in the 1880s divided Africa among European powers. So we see here French and the British had most of the territory. Belgium had a very rich territory in the Congo, and other places were Germany, Italy, Portuguese as well. And to the right, we have the main resources of each country. It wasn't the only resources, but these were the main resources. So 1896. So now we're going to start to get into more of the immigration policies. Salaried immigration agents promote white immigration, discouraging Black immigration through unnecessary medical examination. Medical examiners were paid bonuses to deny Black immigration. Black American doctors paid to promote Canadian climate as dangerous in Oklahoma and Kansas to would-be Black immigrants. This was Canada's way of dealing with the American Negro problem. So they were paying doctors to tell would-be Black immigrants that the Canadian climate is too dangerous. Probably something to the effect of it's way too cold for Black people to come to, so just stay in America. So 1896 to 1914, approximately 3 million Caucasian settlers came to Canada compared to the 5,000 who came from the Caribbean and the free Africans from America. So white labor movement. When the labor movement began momentum in Canada in late 19th century, workers began organizing the formation of trade unions for the purpose of improving the quality of life through working conditions for employees. This was exclusively for whites, as Black workers were systematically denied membership. So this was essentially a white nationalist club cloaked in the veil of a labor movement. 1900s, the increase of Black settlers into southwestern Ontario during the 19th century, well into the 20th century, led to racial tensions. Harrow, the town closest to SS number 11, had segregated restaurants and a whites-only movie theater. So SS 11 was a segregated school. We had sundown laws in this area. Kingsville and Leamington had sundown laws, which meant Black people had to be off the streets of the city by sundown. You will not find the laws in the books. They were not written. They were simply public knowledge, says Elise Harding Davis, a seventh-generation African Canadian growing up in Colchester, Ontario. 1900s, data compiled between 1908 and 1960, Black people convicted of violent crimes are punished more severely than white People, 1910 Immigration Act. The federal government mandated racial discrimination with the aim of keeping Canada British and Anglophone. Section 38 of the 1910 Immigration Act authorized the government to prohibit the entry of immigrants belonging to any race deemed unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada, or of immigrants of any specified class, occupation, or character. This was a major whites-only immigration policy restricting Black and other non-white people out. 1911, the Black man as a menace to white society. So with this story of an individual named Hazel Huff, who made up a break and enter and robbery of a diamond ring. She also claimed that she was drugged and sexually assaulted by Black men. So basically, media hysteria ensues and public panic follows. We have terms like the Black Peril, Negro atrocity, the same sentiment of the former Prime Minister John A. Macdonald evoked with the Black rapist myth in 1868. So this idea was continuing on. This idea was continuing on of the over-sexualization, the hypersexualization of the Black man. So this is from the North of the Color Line. This was a book that I spoke about in the Labor and Immigration presentation. 9 days after initial reports of Hazel's maltreatment at the hands of a Black intruder, the young white woman confessed that her entire story had been a racial red herring. Huff admitted that, fearing punishment for losing her mother's ring, she fabricated the attack by a big, burly nigger, specifically because of the outcry over Black immigration. So she just used the hysteria, she just used the atmosphere and the feelings towards Black immigration to create this story that she knew she would get immediate support from and that nobody would question. The chief of Edmonton Police knew 7 days before Hazel's public confession, but he wanted to pour fuel into the anti-African immigration sentiment. The goal was to pressure federal government into further restricting Black immigration. The same year, the city of Edmonton passed a resolution to ban Black people. The same year, the Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire petitioned to the federal government for Black men to be excluded in society. So imagine a feminist group calling for the government to exclude Black men from society because of this idea of hypersexualization and this idea, this false sense of the need for protection against them. The Edmonton Capital, March 27, 1911. This was a Edmonton newspaper. An Edmonton woman continued this tradition and was quoted in an Edmonton Bulletin article titled, "Woman Utters Protest Against Negro Invasion." She warned, "I see the finger of fate pointing to lynch law in the North Country, which will be the ultimate result, as sure as we allow such people to settle among us. There can scarcely be anyone who is not aware of the atrocities committed by members of these terrible communities, the only corresponding punishment for which is the lawless lynching. Already it is reported that there, white women in Edmonton and Peace River districts have been victims of these outrages accomplished in peculiarly fiendish abandon. Where will the end be?" And this is a direct quote from the newspaper. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier drafted a legal order to be declared by the Governor General banning Black Americans from coming in for 1 year. While the order was not officially declared, the efforts effectively halted Black immigration into the prairies by 1912. In 1911, William Thoburn, the Conservative member for Ontario, said in the House of Commons, "Let us preserve for the sons of Canada the lands they propose to give to niggers." So this is what they're saying in the House of Commons in Ontario. It's white nationalism, groups who petition against Black immigration from Oklahoma to Immigration Minister Frank Oliver, Edmonton Board of Trade, Orange Lodge, Edmonton chapter of the Order of the Daughters of the Empire. 1910 to 1911, Calgary and Winnipeg call for the halt of Black immigration. 1911 to 1911, 58 Black women from the Caribbean deemed morally unfit to migrate to Montreal. So we're going to get into more of this aspect in the next week's presentation, but what they mean by morally unfit was the hypersexualization. 1916, Dominion Iron and Steel Company in Nova Scotia imports Caribbean workers for lowest wages and most dangerous jobs. So now we're getting into the theme of when Black people do come to Canada at this time, it's for the lowest wages and basically the jobs that nobody wants to do and are too dangerous. So 1941, 80% of Black women in Montreal employed as domestic workers, working 16-hour days, working under hostile, anti-Black work environments. So World War II, 1914, North of the Color Line, which is a book, as you can see here on the left, examines life in Canada for the estimated 5,000 Black people from America and Caribbean who immigrated to Canada after the end of Reconstruction in the United States. Through the experiences of Black railway workers and their union, the Order of Sleeping Car Porters, Sarah Jane Matthew, the author, connects social, political, labor, immigration, and Black diaspora history during the Jim Crow era. By World War I, sleeping car portering had become the exclusive province of Black men, while white railway men protested the presence of the Black workers and insisted on a segregated workforce. Using the first-hand accounts of former sleeping car porters, Matthew shows that porters often found themselves leading racial uplift organizations, galvanizing their communities, and becoming the bedrock of civil rights activism. So now we get into 1915, the first cinematic movie, Birth of a Nation. I know this is American, but this movie had a very big impact in the movie industry in terms of cinema. This was the original Birth of the Nation that the director and filmmaker Nate Parker took the name from for his movie, his Birth of a Nation. That was a story about the life of Nat Turner, the preacher turned slave revoltist in the United States. And he did it specifically because the mark that this movie left in cinema. So he did that strategically. The Birth of a Nation landmark silent film released in 1915 that was the first blockbuster Hollywood hit. It was the longest and most profitable film that produced and the most artistically advanced film of its day. It secured both the future of feature-length films and the reception of film as a serious entertainment medium. A narrative about the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, and the Reconstruction era that followed. It has long been hailed for its technical and dramatic innovations, but condemned for the racism inherent in the script and its positive portrayal of the Ku Klux Klan. And this was also a story. This is more of a textbook definition, but this was a story about the Ku Klux Klan saving a white woman from Black men. And as you see here, these two pictures is It's supposed to depict a black man. Obviously, he's wearing blackface. The Birth of the Nation is the same black rapist sentiment that John A. MacDonald evoked in 1868. The difference now is the first full feature movie served as a confirmation bias towards black immigration and segregation. So what do I mean by confirmation bias? Essentially, everything that white people were telling themselves about the hypersexualization of black men was now being presented in a movie as if it were fact. The idea of protecting white women's virtuehood was more about policing black males. White males were given leniency against white women and more so against black women in terms of sexual assaults. Black women were left vulnerable against sexual assaults from white men. KKK presence in Canada, 1920, St. Catharines, Ontario, lynching attempt of black ex-soldier, 1922, KKK presence in Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Ontario, and Quebec, 1927, 1,000 gathered to burn a cross in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and declare one flag, one language, one race, one religion, one purity and moral rectitude. In 1930, 75 Klansmen terrorized interracial couple Ira Johnson and Isabel Jones. Oakville Mirror quoted as saying they acted quite properly. The Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire and Women's Christian Temperance Union call for the protection of white women. So again, feminist groups calling for the protection of white women against black men. Housing, a clause in Vancouver real estate deeds going back to 1928 up until 1965 stated that the grantee or his heirs, administrators, executor, successors, or assigns will not sell to, agree to sell to, rent to, lease to, or permit or allowed to occupy the said lands and premises or any part thereof any person of the Chinese, Japanese, or other Asiatic race or to any indigenous or Negro. In the 1920s, city officials in Calgary, Alberta also codified restrictive covenants to prevent black residents from purchasing homes outside of the boundaries of the railway yards. In Sarnia, Ontario, a 1946 property deed for a Lake Huron community of 100 cottage lots specified that property could only be owned by whites and could not be transferred by sale, inheritance, gift, or otherwise, nor rented, licensed to, or occupied by any person wholly or partly of Negro, Asiatic, colored, or Semitic blood. There are also examples of black people being routinely turned away when seeking rental accommodations based on their race, often limiting where they could live. Over time, this systemic discrimination resulted in the concentration of black residents in some neighborhoods like Little Burgundy in Montreal. Civil rights era, 1940, black protesters at Yonge Street because a black boy was denied entry into a skating rink. 1941, indigenous pass systems installed in 1855 ends. 1945, first collective agreement of black union between Black Railway Porters and Canada Pacific Railway. Black people have been organizing and mobilizing around labor rights in previous years. 1946, Viola Desmond, a Nova Scotia entrepreneur who was arrested for sitting in the whites-only section of a new Glasgow movie theater. 1945, we have the infamous Brown versus Board of Education. 1955, Claudette Colvin challenged the law before Rosa Parks. March 2nd, also in a bus. 1955 as well, we have the Rosa Parks incident. In 1965, the last racially segregated school in Ontario, school section number 11 in Colchester, after newly elected MPP Leonard Braithwaite put forth a motion for the separate schools clause on segregation schools for Black people to be officially removed from provincial education policy. So activists against anti-Blackness in Canada. We have Bromley Armstrong, a long record of activism, including testing the Fair Accommodation Practices Act of 1954, Ontario's new legislation against discrimination. Armstrong and fellow activists of diverse backgrounds visited restaurants in Dresden, Ontario, that continued to refuse service to non-white customers and applied to landlords in Toronto who turned away Black and other racialized renters in Edmonton. We have Ted King, who challenged racial segregation in his role as the president of the Alberta Association for the Advancement of Colored People, AAACP. In 1958, he spearheaded a lawsuit against the Barclay Motel because the owner informed him that we don't allow colored people here. King used the courts to effect social change. And we have Marlene Green, founded the Black Education Project in Toronto in the late 1960s to advocate for Black students who experience systematic racism in the public school system. She wrote the first report on race relations in Toronto, in the Toronto Board of Education in 1979 after facilitating a community consultations which detailed recommendations to address parent concerns. So 1960s, the end of minstrel shows in the US, as minstrels was very common throughout Canada into the 1970s. This is a picture of a minstrel show, one of the many different types of minstrel shows. So 1961, 95% of Canada's settler population is European. 1962, Immigration Act removed all references to race. So we see a graph here. And this is the minority population as of 1981, 1986, 1991, and it starts to increase more. Well, it continues to increase, but it's the 2000s where there's more and more. This is the entire minority population, so Black people and all other non-white people of color. 1964, Africville is forcefully bulldozed and pulled apart. African residents were displaced. Africville was an African-Canadian village located just north of Halifax and founded in the mid-18th century. The city of Halifax was responsible for this act. The mayor of the Halifax Regional Municipality apologized for the invasion in 2010. A settlement was reached with some of the families in 2010. In 2018, a judge turns down application for a class action lawsuit over Africville communal lands from other families not involved in the 2010 class action suit. So there's a bit of a dispute because in the first settlement, and that was in 2010, it didn't include all the families. So there's a bit of a lag, 8 years or a little less, a few years when a second group initiated another application, and this was to make Africville a communal land, but it was turned down, unfortunately. So this is a picture of Africville. 1967, Canada adopts a new flag. So Canada starts to clean its national image. 1967, Canada adopts a new flag. 1971, Canada formally adopts the multicultural nation by Prime Minister Trudeau. This is the father of current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who was caught in a blackface scandal sometime late last year. 1976, Canadian immigration opens up to Africa, Asia, Middle East. 1983, the last Canadian racially segregated school in Nova Scotia closed in 1983 in Guysborough County. And in 1996, the last residential school operated by the Canadian government, Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan, was closed in 1996. So that brings us to the end of enslavement and segregation. Canada was calculated in their role in chattel enslavement and segregation. This laid the foundation for segregation, immigration, education, housing, and labor policies into a society shaped to be an anti-Black environment following enslavement. Policies systematically instituted second-class citizenship on Black Canadians and Indigenous while simultaneously privileging white Canadians. Canadian society was just as calculated, trying to erase their history of anti-Blackness by adopting multiculturalism. Canada is a common but separate structure, part of the worldwide ideology and practice of anti-Black oppression, next to less popular struggles in Brazil, Australia, and South America. So the key areas for this presentation were enslavement, segregation, state policies, education, housing, and the results, poverty, police state, mental health, miseducation, increasing wealth gap. So for the next presentation for week 2 will be immigration and labor. I want to thank everybody who tuned into this presentation. Hopefully you learned a lot and you've been taking notes, and hopefully you tune in to the next week and all my other future presentations as well. If you want to help support me in creating more free resources and education presentations, I'm going to leave a link to my book below, 166 Days of Excellence. And remember, knowledge was power at a time, but the new power is knowledge applied. Knowledge applied is the new power. So thank you and take care until the next presentation. In 1969, last resident of Africville gives up home. And Africville is really a reflection of what was done throughout the United States when Black people got together and created their own towns and their own systems of living together, essentially. 1970, Canada adopts a new national anthem, O Canada. And this was part of the rebranding of Canada and its history. So Canada cleans up its national image. MP Health McQuire in the House of Commons in 1970 demonstrates this era's distortion of history. The great moment in Canadian history, one which reflects its unique character among nations, is surely that it has achieved nationhood by peaceful means, by the getting together of different communities. So I'm going to read that part again, because this is a direct quote. The great moment in Canadian history, one which reflects its unique character among nations, is surely that it has achieved nationhood by peaceful means, by the getting together of different communities. And this was after they destroyed Africville. This was after they massacred the indigenous through famine and starvation. And this is after all the policies created against indigenous, against Black people through labor, through housing. So this, when I say Canada really try to clean up its image, this is exactly what I mean. It wasn't just a new flag and a national anthem. It's essentially a tone deaf attitude to the real history of Canada. So it's essentially covering up and erasing everything that happened. And we're seeing now, as I said in my last presentation with the residential schools, that there are uncovering the unmarked graves from the residential schools. So it's a lot in this statement, and many statements were made like this. Many statements were made like this from other leaders. Well, I shouldn't say made like this. This was a very tone deaf statement, but we had prime ministers make statements about Black people. We've had, I just mentioned another statement before that was mentioned in the House of Commons. So the history, it wasn't as if the history of Canada wasn't known. The history of Canada is literally in the legislation. It's literally, it's not, it wasn't hidden, especially to other politicians, but this was just a tone deaf lie to rebrand Canada as somehow a peaceful nation getting together of different communities. So this whole multicultural identity was really cooked up to cover up the history. 1971, Canada formally adopts a multicultural nation by Prime Minister Trudeau, which is the father of the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who was caught in a blackface scandal last year. Formerly enslaved Africans are already existing in the lowest poverty conditions for several generations. So this is very important, especially with what this MP previously said in 1970. And really, it's all part of the distortion of history and what really happened. Immigration Act of 1976, passed into law 1978, includes economic contribution to Canada and open to professional skills. Africa, Asia, Middle East, South America, Caribbean arrive in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver in the years following. So now that they want to open up the country, they now want to take all the professionals from other countries to help build Canada. 1978, Canada Pacific and segregated job descriptions. 1983, desegregation in Canada nationwide. Last segregated school closed. In 1996, the last residential school operated by the Canadian government, Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan, was closed. Yeah, so this is the same graph, the minority population through the 1980 to 2000. 1990s, throughout the final decade of the 20th century, multiculturalism was increasingly being promoted as part of Canadian identity through political and electoral discourse. Income inequality and the racial wealth gap continues to grow present. And we will get into the wealth gap in learning objective is to learn the current result of all systematic pillars of racism in Canada through enslavement, segregation, education, immigration, labor, media, mass incarceration. So the modern result of the wealth gap. So Week 1, week 2, week 3, we went through enslavement and segregation, labor and immigration, criminalization and sexualization of Black identity. So just to quickly recap, first records of enslavement in early Canada began in 1628 and ended in 1833. Enslavement was mainly practiced through private ownership, segregation practices through education, housing, and labor. Second-class citizenship existed for Black and Indigenous people. Immigration and labor opportunities were restricted from Black immigrants. Europeans were welcomed with open arms. These immigration and labor policies were an extension of enslavement and segregation. Immigration policies were based on racist attitudes towards Black people as hypersexual criminals. Black people faced longer sentencing rates compared to white people for the same crime. Former Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, politicians, news media, minstrel shows, and the 1950 movie Birth of a Nation have all contributed to distorting the image of Black people in Canada. Canada's multicultural identity wasn't instituted till 1970s onward. Canadian media and entertainment was complicit in destroying the image of Black people by hypersexualizing them as criminals, prostitutes, and rapists. So we're going to be looking at a lot of charts. We're going to be looking at a few articles. So this is actually from Policing Black Lives. Since the beginning of the 1980s, poverty levels in Canada and across the global north have been steadily rising. So this is a breakdown of visible minorities by 2000s. So as we can see, a very big Asian population. Well, this is for Ontario. So just one province in Canada. So this is the visible minority population from 1981. I actually forgot to mention this in one of the previous, in the labor and immigration presentation, that this percentage of 5 virtually stayed the same from 1960 all the way into 1981. So even just after 1962, when they removed references of race from the immigration policy, it did not really affect immigration for about 20 years. And not until 1986 is there a growth in immigration. That's when we start to see, this is like really 1986 is when it really eased up, when they decided to really ease up on immigration. So yes, I just wanted to add that because I forgot to say that, because in 1961 it was 5% as well. So this is from the Toronto Star. Canadians who identify as visible minorities do not have the same access to investments and other sources of wealth as non-racialized people, such as a new report on income inequality that looks at the financial impact of racism beyond jobs and wages. The growth of income inequality is undermining the promise that diversity is our strength, and that's a problem, said United Way President Danielle Zanota. In the 1980s, Toronto was dominated by middle-income neighborhoods. In the 1980s, Toronto was dominated by middle-income neighborhoods, said Holchansky, who has tracked Toronto's 3 cities of high, middle, and low-income areas since 1970. But now those neighborhoods make up just 29% of the city, while almost half of Toronto's census tracts, 48%, are low-income, where residents residents bring in between 60% and 37% of the average GTA income. So from a Nursity article from 2020, you now have to make 135K a year to be considered middle class in Toronto. And this figure, 135K, is for families. The median after-tax income of all Canadian families and unattached individuals was 62,000 in 2019. For non-senior families, where the highest income earner was under 65 years of age, the median after-tax income was 93,000 in 2019, and that was from StatScan. I'm gonna have all the sources to all the presentations in a Word doc that's gonna be part of the presentations. I'm going to have all the PowerPoints and all the webinars accessible with all the sources. So these articles you'll be able to find in the sources. And so looking at this, talking about the median, I just wanted to show with these two specifically, because this of the 135K is 135K is a new figure that we haven't really heard of before. So it's just showing the growing disparity between in the wealth gap. And this median, I thought it was interesting to put both of these numbers because the median after-tax income of Canadian families is 62,000. But then when you look at non-senior families, then it's 93,000. So essentially anybody who's still currently working, which is most of the population, even with that, you could see the gap between the non-seniors and basically all Canadian families. Whites are also overrepresented in middle income neighborhoods where the average income is 49,000. Money buys choice, and people with the most choice are choosing to live in certain areas, Holchansky says, explaining the disproportionately high concentration of white residents in high and middle income communities. So when we're looking at these three different charts, low income, middle income, and high income, whites are 73 in high income neighborhoods. And we see that black is a sliver of 3%. And just so everybody knows, a lot of these articles are old. This one is from, yes, 2016. So just so everybody's aware, I mean, for the most part, these numbers haven't changed for white people. If anything, it might have grown. But this is the earliest data that we do have in terms of showing these disparities. And there's going to be other graphs as well too to really paint a very broad picture. So in high income, whites are 73%, black is only 3%. We look at middle income, whites are 61%, and black is still 5%. And then when we look at low income neighborhoods, black is 13% and white is 31%. And the reason that is because white people is a bigger population than black people in Canada. And then we look at some of the other races as well, Chinese, South Asian, and other, and them too, they have bigger populations than black people. Black people is the third largest ethnic group in Canada. It is Chinese and then South Asian, and then we have black people as the third largest. That does need to be taken into consideration, but we also have to take into consideration that Black people have been in this country longer than Chinese and South Asian, and pretty much everybody else as well. And when you take into consideration the immigration policies that stopped Black people from coming into this country, that will affect the numbers as well too. Because once they pretty much opened up the floodgates, South Asian and Chinese came in and quickly became the number one, the largest ethnic groups in Canada. But all this needs to be examined because Black people were here before everybody else, and Black people continue to represent low income neighborhoods by a great proportion. So all of these different factors need to be taken into consideration, like the history and everything. We can't just look at the numbers and just take it as face value. So discrimination is not at the same level as in the United States, Ho Chansey says, but that doesn't make it any better for those who face that problem here. The analysis shows about 25% of racialized people earned income from investments in 2015, while nearly 31% of non-racialized Canadians received money through investments that year. That average amount earned was 7,700 for racialized people and 11,000, almost 500 for white people. People in affluent neighborhoods have networks, technology, peers, and colleagues they can use in a time of need, Pultranchek said. But people in our area don't have those networks. Their next door neighbor doesn't know how to help them. Their brother doesn't know either because he's in the same sort of situation. High levels of income inequality are linked to many social and economic problems, including lower levels of trust, decreased concern between people from different backgrounds, higher rates of violence and mental illness, and unstable economies, the report notes. And not to say that there isn't people succeeding in the Black community. I don't want to paint the picture that nothing is going on, that it's all despair. And I mean, from we see from the chart, it's only a fraction of people who are able to break barriers into the highest income in Ontario. But we still have to acknowledge and recognize the history that has caused this to happen, because we shouldn't be at the very bottom if we were here since the beginning. We should have affluent neighborhoods as well. We should have affluent networks, affluent areas that we can go to get the resources that we need on our own. We shouldn't have to ask the government for funding or any resources. But when we look at the history and see why exactly we are in the position we are in today, it's very clear that there's been systematic problems even after enslavement and segregation. There still continue to be systematic problems that we are still feeling the effects of till today. So definitely there's people succeeding, but that sliver of 3% is not enough to effectively change and effectively impact the rest of the middle and lower class, because the numbers is there's a gap with that in itself between the higher class Black people and the lower class Black people. That's a gap in itself. So when we look at how white people overrepresent high income, they have so many people in high income that they could affect more people. Average income by racialized status from 1980 to 2015. So racialized essentially is everybody that's not white. And then we look here from 1980. So remember in 1980, there was only 5% of the population was a minority, meaning everybody who was not white. And then, so we're looking at this graph and it steadily goes up. This is the average income. So it steadily goes up pretty much almost 50,000. And when we look at racialized, it's essentially, we can't even, well, yeah, it's somewhat of a line. It's stagnant. It's moving sideways. It's not moving up or down. It's just moving sideways. It's just kept the same. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion and analysis on why that is, but it's not a problem for white people in this country. They're steadily going up. And I'm sure if we looked at more current data, it will show that they have continued to go up. I mentioned that Narcity article with 135K being the new middle class now. So I wouldn't doubt that it's continued to go up, and just barely impacting racialized people as we go sideways. We see from 1980 to 2015 is a 60% increase. And for racialized people, it's a 1% increase. Virtually nothing has changed. So income distribution in Toronto by race. This is a little fuzzy, so I'll try to explain it the best way possible. So we have upper class, middle class, lower class. We have, this was 2005. Let me see. So 2005, then this graph was 2016. So remember, Black people were 3% in high income neighborhoods. Okay, so we look at this graph. So this is the city of Toronto. And this was, yes, this was also the city of Toronto. Okay, so see, Black, it was 3%. It basically looks around 3%, staying the same. And then middle class, just over 30%. And then we have lower class, just over 60%, essentially. So then we go to white. White have a higher representation in middle class. And then upper class it looks to be above 20%. And their lower class is actually more than their upper class. It looks to be closer to 30%. And then, of course, we have Chinese and South Asian as well. So South Asian is 70%, and Chinese is just over 50%. And some people, you know, it's important to know how to analyze the data, right? So somebody might say, oh, the South Asians are doing worse than Black people in terms of lower class, right? Because they're 70, we're about 62, 63 as of 2015. But like I said, South Asians have a bigger population than Black people do, right? So This is why we have to, when we're looking at data, we have to look at the history so we'll be able to better analyze. So that's why history will always be one of the best tools to analyze how to fix solutions and how to look at data like this and really understand what exactly is going on. Yes, we can move forward now. So average income, so not a visible minority, about 50,000. In the Black population, 35,000. So when we're looking at, yes, this graph here, in 1980, it was 47,000, right? This was, I forgot what year this was exactly, but this was part of an article that had 5 different charts. So it is in the sources, but I'm not 100% sure what year this was. But all these are from the Toronto Star, these charts. So average employment income, those age 25 to 64. So we looked at the racialized female and the racialized male. Then we have the white female and the white male. So this is more so a looking at patriarchy and how patriarchy plays a role in income inequality as well. So we look at the racialized female. There's a huge gap between the racialized female and the white male. Black Canadians, so average total income. Black Canadians make less annual income than non-racialized Canadians, both for new immigrants and third generation Canadians. So we're looking at this. So when they say not a visible minority, they're essentially talking about white people. So for the black population, it's even first generation. For some reason, the second generation and third generation is doing worse than the previous generations. When we're looking at white people, when they start off at 50K, go up to 55K, and essentially looks like they go lower for third generation down to about, I would say that's a 49K from 51 first, 57 second, and then 49 third. Just when we're looking at the cost of living going up and all those different factors, the cost of living going up, food going up, the cost of housing going up and that sort of thing, it's I could see why it's like a rainbow essentially. We're looking at the black population. So essentially, if it's harder for white people, the later generations to do better than the previous generations, then how is the black population expected to grow when the growth hasn't been shown? The growth there's no growth, there's only sideways movement, right? So that has to be taken into consideration as well, that essentially generation from generation is just making the same amount of money. And I'm sure a lot of analysis can be put into that as well too. So this is a very broad chart. Percentage living in low income, 2015. So the Toronto average, it's about 20%. All immigrants, 23%. Children in male lone parent families, 24%. Self-employed, 24%. Recent immigrants from 2001 to 2010, 26. Visible minority, 26. Children, 26. Working age, 25 to 64. Did not complete high school, 31%. Then we have Black, 31%. Racialized children, 33%. So we have children at 26 and racialized children at 33%. One person household, 33%. So we look at children in male lone parent families, 24%, and then one person households, 33%. So we have Korean at 36. New immigrants from 2011 to 2016, 38%. Living in rental high-rises, 39%. Children in female lone parent families, 40%. Senior living in rental high-rises, 43%. Arab, 43%. West Asian, 46%. Newcomer children arrived 2011 to 2016, 47%. And children living in rental high-rises, 49%. So a lot of information with this infographic. There is asterisks, which will I don't have the conditions that they have set, but it is in the article. So the richest 1% of Canadians made 15 times more than the average Canadian made in 2010. And in 1980, the ratio was 9 times. How does your city rank? So the richest 1% of Canadians made 15 times more, and in 2010, and in 1980, it was only 9 times. So now this chart shows the ratio of incomes of the richest 1% to the richest of us in cities across Canada. So across all of Canada is 15% in 2010, but it's varying multiplications for each region. So in Calgary is 26, Toronto is 23, Vancouver 18, Montreal 15. So Montreal 15 is the average. Then we have Regina 13, Winnipeg 12, Halifax 11, Ottawa 11. Unemployment rate, Black Canadians are far more likely than non-racialized Canadians and other visible minorities to be unemployed. So other visible minorities is 5.7, while Black population is at 12.5. This is as of 2016. So now disposable income. I put this chart because this shows, I think this is a great way to show disposable income, and not just for something useless, for something constructive in terms of parents providing for their children in recreational sports. So this is the average cost of signing up your children for hockey. So we have registration fees at $750, hockey camps about $300, accommodations for tournaments about $300, travel to games about $300. Other equipment, $250. That's for the day-to-day playing. Travel to tournaments, $218. Skates, about 200. Sticks, about 150. Additional ice time, about 100. Team apparel, jackets, hats, about 68. Accommodations for games, about 65. And then other 154. I don't know how they came up with other, maybe food or something. Not 100% sure, but essentially everything comes up to about $3,000. Um, I wouldn't say this is per year, but definitely a lot of these expenses are reoccurring. Other than the helmets, like the equipment stuff, the skates, um, I guess the apparel. Definitely most of this stuff is reoccurring. And even with the equipment too, the equipment is not going to last forever. So I would say, I'm not a hockey expert, but I would say every few years it would the equipment would have to be replaced. If a child changes teams or something, they would have to get new jerseys and that sort of thing. So like even with the equipment too, it's not gonna last forever, right? So a lot of this stuff will be reoccurring payments. Essentially, if a child is signed up from the earliest age, we could say 5, 6, 7, all the way up until high school, that's more than 10 years of these types of expenses. And that just goes to show when we look at recreation in the Black community, essentially what we really have is basketball, and it doesn't cost a lot of money to get your child signed up into some type of recreational basketball. The most equipment that would need to be bought would be shoes and a basketball, maybe a basketball hoop to practice at home, but basketball hoops are very, very accessible, so that's really not needed. But in terms of disposable income, I think this was very important to show because Black families don't dominate hockey leagues. White families dominate hockey leagues. So Dr. Claude Anderson, author of Powernomics and Black Labor, White Wealth. I added Dr. Claude Anderson because he is one of the few people that we have that has gone into the education system and came out with various credentials and decided to come back to help the Black community. We will be getting into more of his credentials later on, but I feel like this part, even though he does talk about America, I feel like this part is very essential to the topic of the wealth gap because the wealth gap is nothing new. Actually, the idea of the wealth gap comes from the United States. So despite Black America's 280 billion in disposable income, Anderson says, Black people as a group remain impoverished because only 2% of our total income growth remains in the Black community. What makes Anderson's book provocative is the way he takes on the popular myth that Black people contributed little or nothing to creating this nation's wealth and power. Painstakingly, he details how the labor of Black people from the time of enslavement until today helped to lay the foundation for the nation's current well-being. But he notes that the increasing reliance on computers and immigration labor has all but ended white society's dependence on Black muscle power. Essentially, what I just read from the Washington Post, speaking on his words, is nearly verbatim of the history in Canada. Canada got its wealth off of the back of slaves and labor. Canada continued to keep opportunities for European immigrants. They gave the lowest paying jobs, the lowest quality lands, the most dangerous jobs to Black people. When we created Africville, they destroyed Africville. Right now, Africville should be an affluent neighborhood, right? So what all this in terms of the history between the United States and Canada is very similar when we're looking at wealth, labor, capitalism, to be specific, and the current state of the nation. Africans in Canada and Indigenous is the reason for Canada's well-being, because the land was took, and from enslavement and then segregation. I mean, I'm just going to continue on because I'm just going to let Dr. Claude Anderson really speak for himself, because he could explain it 100 times better than I could. So this is going to be about a 15-minute presentation, and this will end off the presentation on the wealth gap.
Hello, don't you dare touch that mouse. You are right where you are supposed to be, and that is on the Powernomics YouTube channel. I'm Dr. Claude Anderson, probably your only Black forensic historian in this nation. Today I got a couple of things I want to talk to you about. First of all, to let you know that I'm here to do what's never been done, and that is to connect the dots between where Black folk are, what got them where they are, and what's been keeping them where they are. And we're going to start by giving you the right data and the right understandings. Now, my first commitment is something I learned years ago as a young man. Back as a young man, I said to myself once, in looking at some historical documents, that I'm going to do something to try to take care of the most beaten, enslaved, Jim Crow, maldistributed people in the world, and that is the Black people in this nation. They've been beat up on by every generation, of every ethnic group, every religious group, every cultural group, every language group. Everybody has exploited, misused, and enriched themselves off of Black folk. So I said to myself, I got to do something. And the first thing that I said I was going to do, when I looked around, I saw a picture of a praying Black slave. And what he was saying is that he said, I pray that one day there shall rise among my people a warrior who would know our suffering and would be able to fight our battles. Well, I'm here. I might not be that warrior, but I am going to try to fight Black folks' battles. I made a commitment to myself back in those days to say, anytime I get a chance, I'm going to try to bring some justice to those beaten, underclass, subordinated, and lynched, castrated, misused, and abused people called Black Americans. Now, in doing that, I said, how should I go about doing it? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get as much education as I could. And so I was blessed. I earned about 6 college degrees, everything from social economics to politics to education and to business. And I'm very proud of those accomplishments. Then I said, now how do I best use those things? Or how do I get any blessings or return for having acquired all these different degrees? It happened just like I anticipated and was delighted to have happen. And that is, I got appointed, first of all, to some of the best positions a man could ever have. In education, for instance, I got a chance to teach every grade level from the elementary school levels to high schools, to junior colleges, and to 2 or 3 universities. And lastly, I got a chance to be appointed to be over education for the state of Florida for about 7 years, from 1970 to 1977. That was a very unique appointment. Governor Robyn Maynard appointed me to be over everything in education in the state of Florida. That's from the elementary school all the way to the graduate schools in both the private sector and in the public sector. That was very special, and I enjoyed doing that. And I tried to bring some justice and some better educational opportunities for Black folk and Black children in the state of Florida. Next thing I knew, I said, now what else am I going to get for having acquired all these different degrees? Then ironically, I was appointed to be the first Black in the history of the nation to ever be to manage a presidential election for Jimmy Carter. I was Jimmy Carter's campaign manager in the South and in Florida. I didn't say I was I was participating in a political campaign, like passing out literature or knocking on doors. I was the actual manager, a black man managing the presidential election. Following that, I also had a chance to be the deputy political strategist for Bill Clinton in Maryland. As I made twice, I had those opportunities to be a manager for presidential elections. Secondly, I got a chance to run political campaigns for attorney generals, for governors, for mayors, for state legislators, and for general elections for school board members. And so I got a chance to understand the real nature of politics. So I appreciated that. But most importantly, because of my running a campaign for Jimmy Carter, I got the chance to be the first black appointed to Assistant Secretary in the United States Department of Commerce and be a sub-cabinet member for a president. In that position, I also got a chance to operate. That's something no black had done before, and that was to operate as a advisor and a director and a chairman for economic development for governors in the southeastern states, and advocated and advised them in developing economic opportunities in the southeastern states, period. I head up trade missions for the governors in the South, in the Caribbean, in Africa, and also in Europe. And so that was a very unique opportunity. Also in that position, with the president, I had a chance to also be able to over the surplus property program for the federal government, where my signature alone, I could sign a piece of paper and give away surplus property to anybody I wanted, anything that the government had. All I needed was to get the serial numbers of that property. I had 45 member staff down in Charleston, South Carolina. And that was a very unique opportunity. It allowed me to have a chance to appoint and to push through the election or the appointment of 3 black federal judges. And so I appreciate those opportunities. And when I left that administration,
in this, what I would call like a new vision for black economic prosperity, how do we make attempts to counteract, this racism, this classism?
mm-hmm.
How do we counteract it? And if we are to create a new paradigm?
It's very easy, Sheldon. That's a good question, Sheldon. You gotta do everything you can to learn how to acquire wealth. And what is wealth? Wealth is the result of labor. You cannot have wealth without having labor. Somebody provides the labor, somebody owns, and somebody increases or aggregates the wealth. Black people around the world have been the primary generators of labor. Whites have owned their labor. And what the problem is whether you're talking about in Africa, the Caribbean, or America, you had black folk with the laboring class, but guess what? You didn't get any wealth. You know why? Because your labor was stolen from you. Nobody paid you for your labor. You weren't compensated from it. Whites got enriched off you around the world. And so consequently, they owe you. They owe you an indebtedness. They have stolen your wealth. There's no way you can compete without having wealth. What you own and control in the United States or in Canada will determine what your rights and opportunities will be. You got to get capitalism. Excuse me. Do not try to practice socialism in a sea of capitalism. Don't be the only people in the world, only group in the world trying to practice socialism in a capitalistic society.
Yeah, that's it. And those two things are incongruent, is I'm assuming from what you're saying. Is there a way for socialism to exist within capitalism?
Well, yeah. Well, see, originally in America, what white folks did, and I'm sure they did it in Canada too, they blended the two. But especially the best examples I can give you is in America. Whites in America, they got everything they got. You know how they got it? They didn't get it from capitalism initially. They got it from socialism. This country set up a social construct. And that strong construct was structured in the United States Constitution. And what I mean by that is the United States Constitution became the first affirmative action plan for people in America. But it was strictly for whites. It guaranteed white folk they can get wealth and power by coming to the United States. But they BS you by telling you, well, they came to the country for religious freedom or the right to vote. No, they came to America for 2 different things. They came to America to acquire free labor and free land. Same thing in Canada. They came in, that's socialism. They gave it to them. In the United States, as an example, Sheldon, in this country, United States gave whites in this country through socialism, gave them 2 billion acres of free land. Every white that came to America got 750 acres of land as soon as he set foot in the country. He got paid another 650 acres of land under what they call homesteading. And then for every slave he owned, he got another 150 acres. That is socialism.
Dr.
Everything
Anderson,
white.
you
Go ahead.
just to kind of level the playing field in the conversation, I just want to point out to you that first things first, we're celebrating Canada Day on Monday, July the 1st. We're going to be celebrating our federation, our independence. And the father of Confederation, John A. Macdonald, proposed that Canada should be an Aryan nation. He made this proposal to the Parliament when he was initiating the Chinese Exclusion Act, and during the time that he was exterminating the indigenous people of the plains in order to replace them with imported Europeans. So
That's okay.
white supremacy was written into the policy of Canada during its inception.
That's right.
Right? John A.
That's
Macdonald
right.
went as far as to say that the mixing of races in Canada should be absolutely avoided, and he compared it to breeding a fox with a dog.
And a dog.
That it should not be done.
Right.
Well, that's the same they did in the United States. And see, and the only biggest difference between Canada and here in terms of your policies was that the British were the primary controllers and the distribution of slaves around the world. They were the chief slave owners in the world, and that means through the United States and Canada. And right now, I can't tell you how many trillions of dollars they own, and so you all have not been that distinctively different from how blacks in America were treated. The way you all treated them. You got a black overclass that practices race supremacy. Now you might, but you got to understand, what is white supremacists? White supremacists mean they're superior to it because what they own and control. If I were to come to Toronto right now and find up there that whites own and control all your buildings, your lands, your buildings, your shopping malls, your stores, your production centers, your media, communications, they are superior to you because they own and control it. Now, how are you going to get it back? You got to learn how to practice capitalism. That's why you get it back in Toronto.
So are you sure?
Elephant Room, where we have Dr. Claude Anderson as our guest today. We are talking about segregation, integration, black economics, powernomics, the Black History Reader, reparations, all kinds of things. But just before we went to break, we were talking about how our first prime minister was, pro-Aryan nation.
He actually used the term Aryan nation while he was addressing the Canadian Parliament.
Okay, but in spite of this Aryan nation that he wanted to have Canada rise with, we seem to pride ourselves on this fallacy idea that we are a multicultural nation, that we are diverse and inclusive. And this begs the question of, Dr. Anderson says no,
Shaking his head.
Well, this is why we want to jump into this idea of the segregation versus the integration and what was different. And if we could espouse upon that would be great.
Let me jump in real quick. I know your time is of the essence up there. First of all, the issue, and I love for you and Sheldon to remember this, and you too, LA, don't let them trick you with that. The issue should never be whether you black folk want segregation or integration. That's a fool's wish. What you want is aggregation. Aggregation. They used to tell me back in the South a long time ago, Dr. Anderson, you're confusing us. You got Martin Luther King talking about integration, and you got Malcolm X talking about segregation. Which end of the stick do y'all want? I said, I don't want either end of the stick. I want to be able to have my people to come together anytime, any place, anywhere, and come together and pool their resources to be a competitive group. You don't ask Asians or Chinese or Middle Easterners or Latinos, do y'all want segregation or integration? They only ask black folk that because they want to confuse the issue. You tell them, no, you want ethno-aggregation. Remember that, ethno-aggregation, which means you can come together with any blacks, I don't care whether they're in the Caribbean, Africa, anytime, and do things in your own self-interest. It's not your obligation to try to be blended in. If to blend you in neutralizes you. You're in a competitive race. Racism is a competitive relationship between groups of people. They're competing for the ownership and control of resources. Don't look for no equality in a race-based society. Not in America, not in Canada. You don't need no equality. the poor blacks in Toronto and Canada, you need to be above equality. You need more than that to compensate for how low down you've been for 460 years.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
For clarifying that.
thank you for
Much
clarifying
appreciated.
that. But you know,
Okay, so that is it for this piece. I will put together with everything this entire interview so you can digest it yourself. I did cut up a few parts. I cut out the intro and actually the first bit.
Hello, don't you?
The first bit, this was just an introduction that was on his own channel, so I had nothing to do with the interview. But I will be adding the interview so you could digest it. It's about an hour long, so you could analyze it and digest it on your own. It's not on YouTube, so you can't find it on YouTube. So that's why I will be adding it with this because I had downloaded it a while ago already. So it's unfortunately it's off of YouTube, but of course I still got it because a true researcher holds on to important pieces of information. But that is
Hello,
essentially
don't you dare touch that mouse.
it for the wealth gap. This is actually an hour long. I wasn't expecting it to be this long, but it's very powerful information that I wanted to have. So in conclusion, Canada has been calculated in their role in chattel enslavement and segregation. This laid the foundation for immigration, education, housing, and labor policies into a society shaped to be an anti-Black environment following enslavement. Policy systematically instituted second-class citizenship on Black Canadians while simultaneously privileging white Canadians. Canadian society has been just as calculated trying to erase their history of anti-Blackness by adopting multiculturalism. Canada is a common but separate structure, part of the worldwide ideology and practice of anti-Black oppression next to Brazil, Australia, and South America. Canadian media and entertainment has been calculated in their role in destroying the moral image of Black people. This led delusional fear and mass criminalization of Black people. White people justified their fears by believing that there was a threat of hypersexualization. Canadian society is guilty of passive and aggressive support of policies undermining Black independence and economic self-sustainability. The commitment to multiculturalism was only used and promoted to further displace Black Canadians and weaken group economics. Canada is just one brand partaking in the worldwide structure of anti-Blackness and oppression. Every government is united hand by hand in a united structure of anti-Blackness, but united in ideology oppressing Black people as bottom caste of society, same as Brazil, Australia, and Europe. So thank you for tuning in to this series. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope you've been taking notes, and I hope you'll reference this in your discussions about the history of Canada and what exactly is going on in Canada compared to the United States. As I said, it's not about if Canada is better or worse than United States. Canada is just different, but anti-Blackness is a global ideology. Whether all these governments are doing it in cahoots together or on their own, anti-Blackness is global no matter what. So I just want to thank you again for tuning in. If you want to help support me in creating more presentations like these and other topics, I'll leave a link to my book, 166 Days of Excellence, in the description box. Thank you for tuning in again. Until the next video.